my name's Naomi Litchfield. I'm the Patient Advocacy Manager at Bionical Emas. A bit about my background is, I'm a paediatric nurse. I went into nursing because my little sister Bryony inspired me. She survived 4 rare tumours and she spent a lot of her childhood in Great Ormond Street Hospital for London. I then went on to work there as a senior research nurse. And it was there that I became extremely passionate about rare disease patients and early access, clinical trials and new medicines, as I cared for a lot of rare disease patients and their families. And I saw the impact that rare disease had on their day-to-day life. Part of my current role is to educate patient advocacy groups about early access and what that means, which is part of why we're here today. And also to ensure that the early access programmes that we run at Bionical remain patient-centric. That's enough about me. I'm going to hand over to my colleague Graham.
Thank you, Naomi, and I think it's still good morning. We're absolutely delighted to be here today because I was saying to Rick in the break, it sort of reminds us of what we're doing and why we're doing it, and it's great to see representation from so many cross-functional functions that all feed into the care of rare disease patients. So I'm Graham Sidorowicz. I work with pharmaceutical and biotech companies setting up early access programs. Prior to joining Bionical Emas, I spent about 17 years working for a small to mid-sized pharmaceutical company and a very large pharma company as well. My background's primarily through commercial patient access initiatives and a decent amount of time working in medical affairs functions. So I'm going to give a very high-level overview of what early access programs are, and I'll hand back to Naomi, who'll drill down a little further and touch on what that might mean for patients. So early access programs, what do we mean by early access programs? There are lots of different terms which are used, lots of reference points: compassionate use, named patient. The Americans call it expanded access. You will have heard of the terms cohort use. And in the UK, there's a wonderful scheme in place called EAMS, Early Access for Medicine Schemes, and I'll touch a little bit more on that in a short while. But ultimately, we use early access programs as an umbrella term for all of those reference points. And ultimately, early access programs are a mechanism that enable patients with unmet clinical need to gain access to an investigational medicine when they're unable to enter a clinical trial. And as many people in the room will realise, the rigour, the inclusion, the exclusion criteria for clinical trials makes it very difficult for patients to gain access through a clinical trial. And indeed, with a clinical trial, there's no guarantee you're going to get investigational medicine as well. So it's an important part of the evolution of medicine development, and there's been some big changes over the past few decades indeed. Do we have any film buffs or film fanatics in the room? Looks like I'm on my own. I can see Luke nodding his head, supporting me out. For those of you that are into films, I've popped up on the screen here the Dallas Buyers Club, and it is a fantastic film, multiple Oscar winning. Matthew McConaughey is an absolute superstar in it. But that's not the reason I popped this picture on the slide deck. It's because it's based upon a true story. And it goes back to the late 1980s when there was a huge AIDS crisis. Matthew McConaughey in Dallas Buyers Club suddenly, unexpectedly, finds he has AIDS. And unfortunately, he's unable to access clinical trials, investigational medicines, and really goes to all lengths to gain access to investigational treatments. It includes illegal activities, transportation of drugs, from Mexico, from different parts of the world. But what's fascinating about this is that he does indeed manage, with some like-minded people, to set up a satellite clinic, and patients coming from all over the world to a place in Dallas to gain access to these drugs, which are just currently ongoing clinical trials. At the time, there's great noise about these clinical trials and patients that were reporting remarkable turnarounds in their condition and improvements in health. And in fact, he was told by his doctor that, and as I say, this is based on a true story, he had 30 days to live, and he was on a race from that point. A beautiful story, and really that's the origin of early access programs. So I'd thoroughly recommend watching the Dallas Buyers Clubs, because it'll give you a great bit of insight into the inception of this type of program. And really, on the back of that illegal activity, I think there's wider acknowledgement that something should be in place to enable patients their right to access treatments when they're unable to get access to a clinical trial. And indeed, there's no other way of getting these potential benefits that you can gather. So, more recently, the 21st Century Cures Act is very well legislated and fantastic for patients in need, because what it does, it's a US act, and it mandates that any pharmaceutical company engaging in activities in the United States must put on their website a policy for what they call expanded access. It doesn't go as far as making or mandating that product is available for patients, but it goes as far as saying you have to have a policy. Will you provide access to the product? And if you provide access to the product, what is a route to gaining access to the product? And that alone really stimulates a lot of thought in pharma companies and really makes sure that this is a big part of the ongoing considerations for commercialisation of drugs and ensuring access is granted at the earliest possible stage. Anybody recognise this fella? Okay. Yeah, so in fact, President Trump, only last year, May 2018, he officially signed the federal right to try law. It's a somewhat of an ironic and perhaps controversial law that was implemented last year. In fact, only 2 patients have granted access through this route. But what it did is it really heightened the awareness of early access programs. It made a lot of noise in the press and really did the world of early access programs some great good, because it raised the profile considerably, and lots of companies, lots of patient groups all talking about it. You're probably not thanking me for giving you a US history lesson. I do realise that I'm speaking to largely a group of people based in the UK and supporting patients in the UK. But I did want to touch on the history and the origin of early access programs, because I think it provides a nice backdrop and a nice reference point. Actually, in the UK, there are a couple of mechanisms of gaining access. There's a named patient route, very simple. It's a patient-by-patient request. But back in 2014, there was a scheme which I just alluded to called Emas, Early Access to Medicine Scheme. And in our opinion, this really is one of the front runners, because it provides very clear, transparent guidance on how a company can work with patient organisations, the MHRA, to provide a route for access for a product. What I'm not going to do is go through this patient flow just now, but just to highlight, it is really quite clear, and it's a very simple flow point. One thing that the UK really are leading the way with early access programs is the collection of real-world data and subsequently the generation of real-world evidence. Actually, the Emas scheme really nicely provides reference points, unlike any other documents that you find there in different frameworks. The US stuff is an example of that. It doesn't give clarity on what data you can collect, why you should collect it, and what you can do with it. And of course, an early access program is the first opportunity that we have to learn about how a patient will respond to an investigational medicine. So Emas provide clear guidance. There's some advisory group type contact opportunities, and that allows you to shape data collection to reflect the needs of a portfolio. And what it doesn't do is displace any normal regulatory routes, but what it does do, with careful consideration and collaboration, it allows you to offer some supplementary information, perhaps to plug some gaps in a current system. And in fact, it goes one step further to ensure that data can be included in the NICE technology appraisal submission dossier, and indeed the reimbursement process. So it's all very well and good having a scheme. How frequently is a scheme accessed and used? Well, I guess in a period of roughly 5 years, a little over. The first step, which you'll see just up here on the left-hand side, the first step for an EAMS application is something called PIM designation. PIM stands for Promising Innovative Medicine, and it comes with a number of benefits. It essentially upweights and prioritises a product through the developmental pathway. So that's the first step for an EAMS application. And so far, 98 applications have been submitted, of which 73 have been granted. And not all of those PIM designations go on to full EAMS applications. To date, and we looked this morning, there are 29 EAMS schemes in the UK which have been implemented so far. One example of that in rare disease, and I'm sure some people in this room will be familiar with this story, is Raxone in Duchenne muscular dystrophy. And a really nice illustration of a pharmaceutical company collaborating with patient groups, healthcare professionals, and indeed the MHRA. And the end product is sustained access to an important medication which has a huge impact on patients' lives. So the two key benefits of early access, the first really is to ensure patients with unmet need gain access, but also to provide a provision and framework to ethically respond to requests for access. You can imagine from a pharma company's perspective, everyone wants to try a new revolutionary product which has got new hope. How do you do so in a transparent, ethical manner? Naomi will talk a little more about that. The other part, which historically wasn't really considered an important element of early access, is a collection of real-world data and the generation of real-world evidence subsequently. And some of the directives which are available and currently being worked on at an EMA and FDA level are really quite clear on the changing weighting of utilisation of real-world data as opposed to historical randomised control trials. Of course, any data collected through an early access process can be utilised for scientific publications, and it can really inform the community of respective disease areas. It can also inform prospective research. Normally these programs are running in parallel with late phase 2, early phase 3 programs, and some of the interventions, some of the logistics which are an important part of the early access program, the learnings can be taken to inform prospective research. Any early insights can shape future trials. But perhaps most importantly, it's a real-world patient population. It's much more representative of the patients that physicians are seeing, perhaps unlike a clinical trial environment. So I hope that gives you a high-level overview of what early access programs are, and perhaps some of the mechanisms to administer an early access program, as well as some of the benefits of collecting data. I'm going to hand over to Naomi, who can do a much better job than I to talk about what that means for patients and, of course, rare disease.
Thank you, Graham. Thank you. Now, for those of you who don't know, this is Josh Hardy. He was 7 back in 2014, and he became the centre of a social media campaign when his mother Amy was told while he was lying in intensive care that there was no other treatment for Josh. The doctors told Amy that they'd done all they can, and they had actually applied for a compassionate use request to a pharmaceutical company who had a drug in development that could potentially save Josh's life. But because it was still in development and had only passed safety, so that's phase 1 and phase 2 of the clinical trials, it was still undergoing phase 3 and hadn't passed efficacy. So the pharmaceutical company declined. As you can all imagine, I'm sure today everyone can relate to the fact of being told that, and I stand here as a mother and can say if that was my son, I would be absolutely devastated and would do anything I could to get access to that drug and speak to anyone that listened. So that's exactly what Amy did. She created a Save #Josh campaign, went on Facebook, went to national news, and she petitioned and gained thousands and thousands of signatures. And she managed within 1 week to have Josh enrolled into an expanded access programme and get access to the drug. With 4 doses, Josh went from intensive care to home. And that's just an incredible story. And I think it just really highlights the power of patient advocacy and the power of social media. And this is what really drives this space and what drives us that works in this space. When we hear from doctors that we're working with that they thank us for the timely response of getting the drug to the hospital and the impact that it's had on the patients' lives, it's really rewarding, especially when it's life-saving. So I'm just going to touch on the landscape now in rare disease for early access. And as I reflect myself how much it's changed over the last 10 years, it's really encouraging and exciting to see a lot more pharmaceutical companies investing in rare disease and a lot more drugs in development. This is really great for patients. There's more patient advocacy groups now, and they're more informed than they ever were before. And I think quite rightly, they're more demanding to access these medicines that are in development, because sometimes that's the only option and only hope, especially progressive rare diseases, which I'm sure you can all relate to, because time is so precious. Clinical trials are fantastic and very important, and this is how we get these new drugs approved. But again, like Graham's already mentioned, they are very strict and they have lots of inclusion and exclusion criteria, which not every patient is eligible for. And also, even when we get these drugs approved, they might be approved in one country, but not in the country where the patient is in need and can't get access. So really, for rare disease, there are little options, and if there's nothing licensed for them, they are not eligible for a clinical trial. The only hope is an early access programme. So a few challenges of setting up an early access programme for rare disease. In an ideal world, all pharmaceutical companies would set up an early access programme, and I hope that we will see more of them in the future. But one of them is resources. A lot for rare disease, the resources of even manpower, the expertise, the finances, can be a challenge, and often a solution is to outsource it to another company like ourselves that run early access programmes. Also, there's lots of laws and legislation around who can request an early access. So an unsolicited request from a doctor just means that it can't be promoted. So the pharmaceutical companies can't promote these drugs that are in development. And even if they're getting a lot of access, a lot of requests for access from patients, they have to kindly decline and ask them to go back to their physician and ask the physician, the doctor, to request on their behalf. And that is the treating physician, so in that specialty, so not like their local GP, but actually the doctor that's treating them for that special rare disease. Another challenge is obviously the supply of the drug, because there's not always an endless supply, and when it's in development, the priority must be the clinical trials. So a clear feasibility needs to be done at the beginning of an access programme to ensure that they have enough drug for the early access programme. We would never want to start a patient on an early access programme and then run out of drug. The clinical trials always take priority because that's most important of getting them approved. But the most important challenge is obviously safety, because safety is paramount, and we need to know if there's any SAEs which are serious adverse events, and that this data is collected appropriately. And as Graham mentioned about the real-world data, all of this data from early access programmes is very important to help get these drugs approved. So I just wanted to touch on gene therapy, and I know we heard from Adrian this morning about stem therapy and how exciting so many pharmaceutical companies now working in gene therapy and investing in also, which is very exciting to see, rare disease and how that's transforming development. So gene therapy and early access, it gives us another layer of complexity. It's potentially a one-off cure, changing the DNA. It could be literally a cure, or in progressive diseases, it could stop that disease in time. That's unique challenges that gives us, if it's manufacturing, the costs, the time that it's given. Not all hospitals are set up to give gene therapy, and gene therapy can take months, and it depends on the vector and the time. But it's very encouraging and very exciting to see that there are gene therapies being approved that are using compassionate use early access program data. Strimvelis is just one of them, and the EMA did approve that, not only using data from clinical trial participants, but also clinical trial with early access data, which is fantastic, and I hope that we see more of this. Just going into more depth, this paper, what compassionate use means for gene therapies, goes into a lot more detail about the challenges, and one of the co-authors is actually one of our colleagues, Tom, that's co-author of this paper, but also 2 patient advocacy leaders. So I strongly recommend that you take some time to read that. If you're interested, please come and talk to us. Thank you for listening, and I hope that gives you a bit of insight to the work that we do. If you've got any questions, we'd love to take them, but if you'd like to email us, our email address is on the slide. Any hard questions to Graham?